We all kind of take rivers for granted, right? They're
Yeah,
just
yeah.
there, flowing. But for some nations, they simply don't exist. Not a single one. So today we're going deep. Riverless nations. What's it like to live, thrive, really even exist without rivers?
It's a unique challenge, that's for sure. And it's not just a handful of countries we're talking about either. It's 17, spread
Wow.
out across the globe.
17. Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, it's more common than people think. And we're talking everything from, those desert landscapes in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Yemen,
Right.
to these tiny island nations you might not even think about, places like Malta, the Maldives, all dealing with the same reality. No naturally flowing, year-round rivers, no consistent source of fresh water flowing through their land.
Okay, that's a pretty big deal, I'd imagine. I mean, rivers are kind of essential for, well, everything, right?
Hmm.
Agriculture, drinking water,
Yeah.
transportation. I mean, heck, they literally shape the land itself. How do you even begin to build a nation without that?
Well, it forces you to be resourceful, that's for sure, especially when it comes to the economy. Because think about it, basic things we take for granted suddenly become incredibly complex. Agriculture. You can't just rely on river water for irrigation. Take the UAE, for example. They have to import something like 90% of their food.
90%?
That's
Whacker.
huge. It makes them incredibly vulnerable to anything that happens globally. Food prices spike, supply chains get disrupted, they're immediately feeling the effects.
Yeah, that puts food security in a whole new perspective, doesn't it?
Definitely. And then there's the question of drinking water. Desalination seems like the obvious answer, but even that, it's not a simple fix.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that. It seems like it would have to be a huge part of the solution, but I imagine it comes with its own set of issues.
Absolutely. Saudi Arabia, for example, gets about half of its water from desalination. But it's costly. I mean, really costly, both financially and environmentally. You need a ton of energy to run these plants, and often that means relying on fossil fuels, so you're adding to carbon emissions. And then there's the issue of what to do with the leftover brine, that super salty byproduct. Dumping it back in the ocean can really mess with marine ecosystems.
So it's almost like you're solving one problem but potentially creating others. A tricky trade-off.
Exactly. And this kind of constant balancing act, it really fuels some incredible innovation. Like, have you heard about Saudi Arabia's Neo Mound project? It's this crazy ambitious plan to build a megacity from scratch with sustainability baked in from the start. And they're looking at things like atmospheric water generation, literally pulling moisture out of the air to create drinking water.
That sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It's pretty wild. But it speaks to the kind of thinking that's happening in these countries. They're not just trying to survive, they're trying to reinvent the way we think about water.
So we've talked about the economics, the sort of big picture challenges, but what about the everyday impacts? How is water scarcity affecting people's lives in these riverless nations? And what about the environment?
Well, let's take Yemen. They've been over-pumping groundwater for decades. I mean, way beyond what's sustainable. And it's led to some seriously depleted aquifers. And that, of course, fuels all sorts of problems. Social unrest, conflict over dwindling resources. Water scarcity, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It just amplifies existing
Like,
problems.
like a domino effect.
Yeah, exactly. And then environmentally, you see things like saltwater intrusion. It's happening in places like Bahrain and Malta. You pump too much groundwater, and seawater starts seeping in, which of course makes the water undrinkable and messes up the soil for agriculture.
So you're basically stuck between a rock and a hard place. It
Yeah.
really makes you realize just how far-reaching the consequences of water scarcity can be. It touches every aspect of life.
And the really scary part is that climate change is only going to make things worse. We're talking about hotter temperatures, less predictable rainfall. It all just adds more pressure to those already stressed water
Like
resources.
this perfect storm brewing, isn't it? So, okay, how are these nations coping? I mean, we've talked about high-tech solutions like NEOM and desalination, but are there other things they're doing, other strategies at play?
Absolutely. And this is where things get really interesting because it all ties into something we call hydropolitics. The idea that water resources, or the lack thereof, can really shape international relations. And you see this playing out in all sorts of ways, both positive and, unfortunately, negative.
So water as a tool of diplomacy.
Exactly. A good example of this is the Dizzy Aquifer Agreement between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. It was back in 2008, and they basically agreed to share these underground fossil water reserves, a real example of cooperation driven by a shared need.
So there is hope for finding common ground even in the face of scarcity.
Definitely. But of course, it doesn't always work out that way. There's this ongoing dispute between Bahrain and Qatar, and part of the tension there is linked to competition for water resources. It just goes to show how fragile things can be when water is at stake.
It's like this constant tug of war, isn't it?
Yeah.
So beyond these international dynamics, what about the countries themselves? What are they doing internally to adapt and become more resilient in the face of this constant water scarcity?
Well, that's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. Because their stories, they're not just about surviving, they're about innovating, adapting, and maybe even offering a glimpse into the future for the rest of us. So, picking up where we left off, it's easy to get caught up in the high-tech solutions, desalination plants, futuristic megacities, that sort of thing. But what's interesting is that some of the most effective ways these riverless nations are coping, it actually comes down to, well, going back to basics.
Back to basics, what do you mean?
I mean, tapping into traditional knowledge, really understanding the local environment. For centuries, these cultures have had to live in balance with limited water resources, and they've developed some pretty ingenious ways of doing that.
Oh, no, interesting. So it's like instead of always trying to overpower nature, they're working with it.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
take Oman, for example. They have this ancient system called a flage. It's basically these underground channels that collect rainwater and spring water and then distribute it to, villages, farms. It's been around for centuries and it's still incredibly effective.
Centuries. Wow. It sounds like some kind of, I don't know, hidden network like veins running beneath the surface. Are there other examples of this kind of traditional wisdom being used today?
Oh, yeah, tons. Lots of riverless nations are turning to what we call nature-based solutions. Things like restoring wetlands, planting trees to help retain water, simple but effective ways of working with the natural water cycle.
It seems so obvious when you put it like that. So are these efforts actually making a difference?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not a quick fix, but they're seeing results. Groundwater levels are stabilizing in some areas, ecosystems are recovering, and what's really cool is that it often involves local communities, getting people directly involved in managing their own water resources.
Right. It gives them a sense of ownership, right? Like it's not just some distant government agency dealing with it. It's their water, their land.
Exactly. It's about building that connection, that sense of responsibility. And it's something we can all learn from, even those of us who live in places where water isn't quite so scarce.
Right. Right. It's about that mindset shift we were talking about earlier. So speaking of connections, we were talking about how water can be this tool for diplomacy, this hydropolitics thing. Can you give me some more concrete examples of that? Like, how are these riverless nations actually using water to build bridges, so to speak?
Well, I think one of the best examples is actually between Singapore and Malaysia. Now, Singapore is this economic powerhouse, but they're incredibly reliant on Malaysia for their water supply. And historically, that's created some tension, right? You've got this dependence that could easily lead to conflict. But instead, they've really worked hard to use water as a platform for dialogue. They've got these long-term agreements in place. They collaborate on things like flood control, water treatment. It's become this shared responsibility.
So they've turned a potential flashpoint into a point of cooperation.
Exactly. They've recognized that their fates are intertwined when it comes to water. And it's a powerful example of how, even in the face of scarcity, you can find ways to work together for mutual benefit.
And it just reinforces that idea that, the challenges these riverless nations are facing, it's not just their problem, it's a glimpse into the future for a lot of the world as water becomes more and more precious.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to what they're doing, to learn from their experiences. Because they're pioneering solutions that the rest of us may well need to adopt in the not too distant future.
So if we're talking about takeaways, like what are some of the big lessons we can all learn from these riverless nations, regardless of where we live?
Well, I think the most important one is that we need to fundamentally shift our mindset about water. We can't just assume it'll always be there, flowing abundantly. We have to start treating it as the precious resource it is.
So it's about conservation, right? Being more mindful of how we use water, every drop of it.
Exactly. And then the second thing is that we have to embrace innovation. These riverless nations, they're at the forefront of developing new technologies, new approaches to water management. And we need to be willing to share those ideas, to collaborate and learn from each other.
Because this isn't about competition, right? It's about global survival, ultimately.
Right. It's about recognizing that water security, it's a global issue. And the solutions, they're going to require global cooperation.
And a willingness to learn from those who are already on the front lines, like the riverless nations we've been talking about.
Exactly. Their stories, they're not just about survival, they're about resilience, about ingenuity. And ultimately, they offer a message of hope, a reminder that even in the face of these daunting challenges, there's always a path forward if we're willing to work together and think differently.
Well said. So that's the big picture, sort of overarching themes. But I'm really curious to dig into some of those specific solutions we keep hinting at. The actual technologies and strategies these countries are using to make it work.
That's what we're going to do in the final part of our deep dive. We'll get into the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts of how these riverless nations are turning scarcity into, well, maybe not abundance, but definitely a more sustainable future.
Okay, so we've spent this whole deep dive talking about riverless nations, right? The challenges, the resilience. But now I'm really kind of itching to get into the nitty-gritty. You keep mentioning these amazing solutions they're coming up with. Let's hear about them.
You got it. We've done the big picture. Now let's zoom in, get specific.
Perfect. So you know what's been stuck in my head since you mentioned it earlier? Icebergs. Like, seriously, towing icebergs. Is that really a thing, or is that just like some far-out futuristic idea?
It sounds crazy, right? But the UAE, they're known for thinking big. And they've actually looked into this. I mean, imagine it. A massive iceberg, maybe holding billions of gallons of fresh water, just towed across the ocean, from Antarctica to the Gulf.
My brain can barely handle that.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you even move something that huge?
Yeah.
And wouldn't it just, like, melt before it even gets there?
Yeah, that's the big challenge, right? The logistics. But engineers, they're working on it. There are ideas out there, like wrapping the iceberg in this gigantic insulating skirt to keep it from melting too fast, and maybe using specialized tugboats, or even figuring out how to use ocean currents to help move it along.
Okay, so maybe it's not totally impossible. But even if you could do it, would it be insanely expensive and, like, resource intensive? I mean, you're talking about dragging a giant chunk of ice across the planet.
It would be a huge undertaking, for sure. And that's why, at least for now, it's more of a conceptual solution. But it just shows you the kind of outside-the-box thinking that's happening.
It definitely sparks the imagination.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe icebergs are a bit too far out there for the moment. What about stuff that's already happening on a larger scale? Like we talked about desalination, right? But it's got those downsides.
Yeah.
The energy cost, the environmental impact. Is there anything being done to improve that?
Totally. One big thing is solar-powered desalination. Countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, they've got sun in abundance, so they're using it. Building desalination plants that run on solar energy, it's cleaner, more sustainable, and cuts down on those fossil fuel emissions.
Kind of poetic, right? Using the desert sun to create fresh water from the sea. So, okay, what about other ways they're making desalination better?
Well, a lot of it comes down to efficiency. There's a ton of research going into making the plants themselves use less energy. And then there's the question of the brine, that salty byproduct, figuring out ways to maybe utilize it, turn it into something useful, instead of just dumping it back into the ocean.
So thinking about the whole picture, the whole life cycle of the process, that makes sense.
Mhm.
You know, another thing we touched on earlier was wastewater recycling. You mentioned Singapore being a leader in this. What are they doing that's so special?
Singapore has this system called New Water, and it's pretty amazing. Basically, they take wastewater, treat it, purify it, and they do it to such a high standard that it meets drinking water quality. I mean, the water coming out of your tap in Singapore, it's often cleaner than what you'd find in a lot of other places.
Wow. So they're basically closing the loop on the water cycle, right? Turning waste into a resource.
Exactly. And they're even using this recycled water to replenish their underground aquifers, ensuring a more sustainable water supply for the future.
That's incredible. It's like instead of seeing wastewater as a problem, they're seeing it as like potential. Okay, so we've got these high-tech solutions, solar-powered desalination, wastewater recycling. But we also talked about the importance of, traditional wisdom, working with nature. How do those two things fit together?
It's not either, right? It's about finding the best solution for the specific situation. Sometimes the ancient techniques are the most effective. Sometimes it's cutting-edge technology. Often it's a combination of both.
It's like a toolbox, right? You need a variety of tools to get the job done.
Well, I feel like this deep dive has really opened my eyes to how much we all need to rethink our relationship with water. And, the riverless nations, they're really leading the way.
They are. And their stories, they're inspiring, but they're also a wake-up call. The challenges they're facing, they're becoming more and more common around the world. Water scarcity, it's a global issue.
And it's going to take all of us working together, sharing ideas, innovating to figure this out.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with us. It's given me a lot to think about.
My pleasure. It's been great talking with you.